times has this happened to you? You start to speak out against a situation that is morally questionable, maybe socially awkward, or possibly even dangerous. But before you get your mouth open, the person next to you wags his or her finger and says, don't judge. Jesus said so in the Bible. Hi, I'm Pastor Allen, and welcome to New Salem's Midweek Bible Study. Don't judge. Is that really what Jesus said? Are we really told not to make value judgments against other people? Not even when those people are trying to turn society's values on their head? Or is this another situation where people who are really not all that interested in what Jesus has to say, taking his words out of context and twisting them beyond all recognition to mean what they want him to say instead of what he actually meant? When we take a closer look at what Jesus actually said, what we discover is that Jesus' intent was not to forbid his followers from forming judgments, but to govern how they judged. In Matthew 7, verses 1 through 6, in part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives us three broad principles to govern how we evaluate the actions of other people. Here's the first one. Don't judge others by a standard that you're not willing to be judged by yourself. Now, those are my words. What Jesus said in Matthew 7, verses 1 and 2 is, do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it'll be measured to you. Now, note that Jesus' command is not a blanket judgment against all judgment, but it's a call to judge others fairly. How do we know that Jesus was not prohibiting all judgment? Well, in the very next paragraph, as we're going to see in a few minutes, Jesus himself goes on to judge other people by labeling them as wild dogs and pigs. Sounds kind of judgmental to me. In verses 15 through 20, Jesus tells his followers to beware false prophets. That's a value judgment. He goes on to tell us to evaluate the spiritual condition of other people by examining the fruit their lives produce. We have examples from other parts of the New Testament where followers of Jesus are called on to make judgments about others. Consider, for example, 1 John 4, verse 1, where we're exhorted, Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. Or consider 1 Corinthians 5, verse 5, where the Apostle Paul was talking about a church member who was living in gross immorality. And he said, I have decided to deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit might be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. So there, Paul is talking about excluding someone for fellowship, but the purpose is redemptive, to try to bring that person to their senses. If we avoid all judging, then we risk calling evil good and good evil. And I don't think any of us really want to do that. There was a police car that pulled up behind another car sitting on the side of the road. The driver walked up and asked the car's driver if everything was okay. And the driver responded, well, I found out that the bridge ahead was out, so I pulled over here to figure out how to get around it. And the police officer said, have you seen any other cars go by? And the driver said, oh, sure, lots of them, but they never came back. The police officer responded, didn't you try to warn them? The driver shrugged his shoulders and said, who am I to judge? Jesus was not telling us to avoid making judgments. Instead, he was telling us to exercise caution in how we make those judgments. In verse 1, Jesus reminds us that when we apply scrutiny towards someone else, we invite the same scrutiny back towards ourselves. In this sense, Jesus' commandment is simply an application of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Jesus makes this even more explicit in the next verse when he says, in the way you judge, you will be judged. Once there was a village up near the Arctic Circle where the custom was that when a member of the tribe got too old to fend for themselves, the individual's family would take them out, way out to the remotest part of the tundra and leave them to die. One day a father said to his son, Grandpa's time's getting near. Help me load him on the sled and we'll take him on. So the father and the son took Grandpa way out from the village. They found a rock where they could lean him up, wrapped him up in a blanket, and they left him to his fate. About halfway back, it dawned on the father that the son was dragging the sled behind them. So he said, "Son, what are you doing with that sled?" And the son said, "Well, Dad, one of these days, we're going to need this sled for you." The father thought for a minute and said to his son, "Come on, son, let's go back and get Grandpa." Would it make a difference to you to know that you would be held to the same standard that you expect other people to live up to? What's more, Jesus implied that God will hold us, will judge us by the same standard to which we hold others. It's sobering enough to realize that other people are going to judge us by the same standard that we judge them, but Jesus' wording suggests that other people are not the one we really need to be worried about. The verb tense used by Jesus in the Greek is in the future passive, and in the first century, the future passive was often used as a way to refer to actions taken by God himself. Imagine, when you stand before God, do you want him to judge you according to the same criteria that you've used to judge others? If you've been hypercritical and unmerciful in your judgment of others, do you really want God to be the same way with you? If you want God to be gracious towards you, have you exercised that same graciousness towards the people around you? This is similar to what Jesus taught about concerning forgiveness in the Lord's Prayer. Back in Matthew 6, verses 14, 15, he said, "For if you forgive others for their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions." When we forgive others of the wrongs they've done towards us, then we place ourselves in a frame of mind where we're ready to receive the forgiveness that God offers to us. In the same way, if we truly comprehend God's grace towards us, then we're going to extend that same grace towards other people. If we can't be gracious towards others, then maybe we need to step back and take a gut check and consider whether or not we've truly experienced God's grace for ourselves. So we do judge, but we seek to judge fairly. Another way to put this is we seek to critique constructively, not to condemn destructively. Jesus' instructions about the right way versus the wrong way to judge are the difference between a critique and a criticism. A critique honestly evaluates where people are and seeks to help them get where they need to be. Criticism just seeks to tear other people down. One of my favorite verses is Proverbs 11, verse 11, which says, "By the blessing of the upright, a city is exalted, but by the mouth of the wicked, it's torn down." Or as I like to put it, blessings build, but critics corrode. Which of the two are you offering today? A few years ago, there was a particular high school football game that I was kind of interested in, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to the game. So the next day, when I read the recap in the newspaper, I was struck by a contrast. Now, you got to understand, neither team had really played its best, but there was a big difference in the responses between the respective coaches. The coach of the winning team said, and I'm paraphrasing, "Well, we've got a few things to work on, but I'm really proud of our team. Our players didn't get down on themselves. They didn't give up. They held in there and they pulled it out." The coach of the losing team said, and again I paraphrase, "Our offense stunk, our defense stunk, and our special teams stunk." Now you tell me, which of those two coaches would you rather play for? Blessings build, but critics corrode. In terms of judging others fairly, Jesus also says something else of importance. This is our second principle we're looking at. Don't judge the fault of others until you've addressed your own faults first. In Matthew 7, verses 3 through 5, Jesus said, "Why do you look at the speck that's in your brother's eye, but don't notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me look at the speck in your eye,' and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly how to take the speck out of your brother's eye." So what Jesus is doing here is using a really absurd example to illustrate the absurdity of pointing out the flaws of other people while ignoring our own. Jesus drew from his background as a carpenter for an illustration that a lot of people could relate to. Getting a piece of sawdust in your eye. If you've ever had that happen, you know it is, infuriating. But then Jesus took the illustration to an exaggerated scale to prove a point. Imagine a guy walking around not with a speck of sawdust in his eye, but with a whole 2x4. How hilarious would it be to watch a guy with a 2x4 sticking out of his eye trying to find a speck of sawdust in the eye of somebody else? Left unaddressed, our own flaws get in the way of offering any help to other people. You ever notice how easy it is to point out the shortcomings of others without acknowledging our own? I think this is why so many in the church today find it so easy to criticize those who wrestle with same-sex attraction, for example. Now, for the record, the Bible speaks clearly and consistently that homosexual behavior is a sin. However, homosexual feelings are not necessarily a sin, according to the Bible. Rather, they're a temptation to sin. In very much the same way as a heterosexual man may fantasize about a woman to whom he's not married. Now, it's very easy for most of us to come down hard on the first example because we've never experienced that particular temptation. But what if we spoke just as forcefully against adultery or pornography or gossip, which the Bible has a lot to say about? Or how about gluttony, which is another sin the Bible points out? In fact, is it possible that the reason we speak out so forcefully about some sins is because it draws the spotlight away from our own sin? Something to think about. Now, it's not to say we should solve all of our own problems before we address the fault of other people. That would probably be impossible. But we should at least acknowledge our faults and take those into account. This goes back to the idea that we should extend to others the same grace that God has extended to us. When we go around calling attention to the faults of other people while ignoring our own, we create an atmosphere where other people are afraid to be honest about the struggles they're going through and to ask for help. I heard a story once about 3 preachers who went to a conference, and all 3 of them fell under conviction at the conference. And later, when they were alone and they were talking, they began confessing their sins to one another. One said, "Brothers, pray for me." He said, "I wrestle with the sin of drunkenness. Every now and then when I had a rough week, I sneak over to the bar in the next town." Another one said, "Brothers, you need to pray for me." He said, "I wrestle with lust. Every now and then when I've had a bad week, I watch porn on the internet." The third preacher said, "Brothers, pray for me. I suffer from the sin of gossip." Well, I think you can see where that one's going. What would happen if instead of an atmosphere of condemnation, we strove to create an atmosphere of grace, where people could be honest about their sins and seek help in overcoming them? As someone once said, the church should be a place where it's okay to not be okay. It's a scandal that people often find more understanding and acceptance in the local bar than they do at the local church. As Paul said in Galatians 6, verses 1 and 2, "Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ." Here's the third principle that Jesus talks about in reference to, or he suggests in reference to judging other people. Don't fail to recognize that those who reject Christ have placed themselves under judgment. In Matthew 7, verse 6, Jesus says, "Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they'll trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." This is a direct warning against the kind of blind tolerance that many people derive from Jesus' command not to judge. Jesus compared those who reject the gospel to wild animals who can't appreciate the immeasurable value of the gift they're being offered. The proper response to persistent rejection of the gospel is not incessant pestering. Instead, it's a consistent demonstration of the gospel's power lived through our own lives. So hopefully they can see that power in us and be drawn to seek it for themselves. Try as we might, it is impossible to go through life without making judgments. We judge others, they judge us, and we all face judgment from God. Are you judging others fairly? Are you seeking the welfare of the people around you? Are you critically holding them to a standard that you wouldn't dare apply to yourself? Are you treating other people with grace and understanding? Or are you shining a spotlight on their flaws in hopes that no one will notice yours? Have you allowed yourself to be overwhelmed by God's amazing grace towards you? Or are you trampling that grace underfoot like a wild animal who happens across a precious treasure with no real appreciation for its value? Seek to come to terms with the grace that God offers you. When we embrace God's grace through Jesus Christ, then we can be open and honest about our own flaws, knowing that we've been forgiven through our faith in what Christ has done for us on the cross. We don't have to be perfect because he was perfect in our place. And when we come to grips with the amazing grace that God's offered to us, then we can extend that same grace to other people. If you want to know more, please reach out to me at pastor@newsalembaptist.net. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it with your friends. In our next video, we're going to talk about how to keep praying and keep trusting God even when you don't feel like it.